Hello everybody, and thank you for tuning in to today's live stream about Dorico 3. My name is Daniel Spreadbury, I'm Dorico's product manager, and it's my great pleasure to be here today to tell you about all of the amazing new improvements and features in Dorico 3. The piece you've just heard in that lovely video that opened the stream was a piece that we had commissioned for us from the film and TV composer Segun Akinola, which we recorded back in June in London with the Chamber Orchestra of London. And Segun did an amazing job creating a piece that would show off some of the new improvements in the software, including harp pedaling and condensing, both of which we'll talk more about over the next hour. If you'd like to find out more about Segun and about that piece, there's an article on the Dorico blog where you can read all about it and see an interview with Segun about how he approached the piece and about how he used Dorico to write it. So over the next hour, I'll be showing you some, although not all, because there are just so many things to talk about in Dorico 3, of the headline features in the new version. And we're going to start with possibly the biggest of them all, which is condensing. Now, condensing is something that has been part of our vision for Dorico since the very beginning. In many ways, everything that's come before now has been leading up to today and being able to introduce this feature. So what is condensing and why would you need it? So when you're working on music with large ensembles, orchestras, concert bands and so on, one of the great challenges is making sure that you end up with a practical score for the conductor to read from. You're balancing the constraints of page size versus staff size versus the number of instruments that you're having to squeeze in. And when you have upwards of 30 or 40 wind and brass players, for example, then actually fitting all of that music onto the page in a legible way can be a real problem. You have obviously options like hiding staves when players aren't playing, but the best way to balance the constraints of the page and the players is by combining some of the music onto a smaller number of staves. So for example, you might have your 2 flute players sharing a staff, or your 4 horns occasionally sharing staves. Now this, of course, is a very difficult and time-consuming job for a human editor to perform, because you have to decide, based on the music that you're looking at, exactly how the music could possibly condense. Do the 2 flutes play in unison? Do they play the same rhythm but different harmonies? Does flute 2 go over flute 1? Is the texture of the 2 flute parts completely different in 4 bars time? And of course, multiply that decision by N when you're adding extra players and so on. So this can be a very time-consuming task for a human editor to perform. And added to that is the fact that today's music notation software doesn't really give you any assistance with that. A couple of programs have made some sort of limited attempts to allow you to have multiple music for multiple players written on a single staff and still have the parts out the other side. But nobody has really managed to tackle this from start to finish, and that is what we're trying to do with Dorico 3. So we're just going to jump straight in. Let's have a look at a large orchestral score and see how condensing works in Dorico 3. So I have here a movement from Holst's The Planets, which is even called a suite for large orchestra by the composer. So that tells you something about the scale of the forces. And let's just play a few bars of this to remind you what this music sounds like. This is played back by Note Performer. So hopefully you're all more than familiar with that piece. So as you can see here, we have a very large orchestra laid out on A3 paper. 2 piccolos, 2 flutes, 3 oboes, cor anglais, 3 clarinets plus bass clarinet, 3 bassoons, contrabassoons, 6 horns, 4 trumpets, and so on and so on and so on down the page. And then of course you have your normal array of percussion, although 2 timpani players here rather than 1, 2 harps, and a full string section as well. So I counted them earlier on. There are 31 wind and brass players in this piece. And so as you can see, you're having to have quite a small staff size and all the music quite close together in order to squeeze everything onto one page. So the nice thing about Dorico's condensing feature is that it is simply set and forget. You write the music the way you normally would. You write the music for each individual player, not thinking at all about how it's going to appear when it's later on condensed. You simply write the music for each player on its own staff. As I say, don't even think about the condensing, and then when you're ready, when the music is there, then you can turn it on. You turn condensing on simply with one click, as in the edit menu here, the condensing menu item. And for a score this big, even though I'm using quite a powerful Mac, it does take a few seconds to do this. Now, if you think about what Dorico is doing right now, it's doing all of those calculations, all of those editorial decisions that I described a few moments ago. It's figuring out when the music can condense onto a single stem, for example. When does it need to be written as two voices on one staff, or when is it so different between the two players that it can't be condensed at all? And it does this chunk by chunk, phrase by phrase, from start to finish through the whole piece. And of course, it's done now. It's been done for quite a long time while I was talking there. So let's have a look and see what it's done. So you see here, as we now look at the staff labels at the left-hand side of the page, that we now have piccolos sharing a staff, flutes sharing a staff, two oboes sharing together, and so on as we go down. Now, of course, you could technically get oboes 1, 2, and 3 onto the same staff. There are some sort of little technical limitations in the way that condensing works at the moment with empty players, which I'll maybe talk a little bit more about later on. But you can see already that just by looking at what the horns are doing here, as we look at their first entry, that you now get A2, and at the left-hand side of the page, we've got horns 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, and they are now grouped together. And they are showing the same music. That's unison music. All the horns are actually playing the same thing. But because of the way the original score was set up, it was actually set up in the Boozy and Hawkes edition with horns 1 and 2, horns 3 and 4, horns 5 and 6. You could, if you wanted to, condense all 6 horns together into a single group, and then you would actually get a single staff here that says A6. But I've decided to use the same grouping as the original score. And if we keep looking forward through to the next page, you'll see here where there's the big sort of tutti chord from the winds and brass, and you can see that it's all marked up correctly with all of the players there, all playing the things they need to play. When we get to passages where the instruments are playing different music, you can see that Dorico still allows them to share the same staff, but each entry is numbered. It's a little bit hard to see because the 1 is actually kind of aligned with the bar line, but there is the entry of the first flute. And you see that even though the pitches are crossing, Dorico, because the phrases don't align, and you often want to have interlocking woodwind phrases, it allows them to share the same staff. You could change Dorico's mind about this, for example, by specifying a different amount of pitch crossing. As we keep looking through here, you'll see also that at the start of each system, you get a label to remind you what's going on at that particular moment. So you can see, for example, on the clarinets here at bar 21, you've got clarinets 1 and 2 in the upstem voice, and they're marked A2 because there's only one note head, and clarinet 3 in the downstem voice labelled clearly. And then when the condensation changes, as it does just one bar later in bar 22, you see that you get a 3-note chord and it's labelled 1, 2, 3, so that you can be totally clear as to what's going on. And the really neat thing about this is that, of course, all of the original music is still there. If we switch to the flute 1 part, you'll see that there is the flute 1 part, just as it would ordinarily be. But because of the way that condensing works, we're now able to see the full score in a completely different way. Now, there are, of course, some things that you can't do when condensing is switched on. For example, I can't edit any of the condensed music. So this is because at the point at which you might want to start editing the music, Dorico, of course, might not know which instrument the edit that you're trying to make is supposed to apply to. If you change the pitch of a note, it's probably clear enough. But if you're doing things like adding dynamics, adding slurs and so on, it's not necessarily obvious what should happen. And of course, you might not want to add a slur or a dynamic, for example, to all of the players who are currently condensed. However, it does take a bit of getting used to that you can no longer kind of even select or play back from a particular bit of condensed music. So we have a view menu in view notes and rests, condensed music, which will then colour everything that is condensed in a grey colour, so that you can then see that there's something different about it. Because even when you've only got one note showing, as we do have here, for example, in the horns, because it's A2, you still can't edit it or select it. So this is already, I think, pretty groundbreaking stuff. No software has ever tackled this problem before. And the reason that we've been able to do it in Dorico, as I say, is because it's been part of our plans since the very beginning of when we were first designing the software. The whole idea behind the music that belongs to the instruments and is held by the players is that it kind of exists in this sort of abstract form that is one step removed, or sometimes more than one step removed, from the staves that the music actually appears on. And this allows us to do all sorts of powerful things. We're going to look at guitar tablature in a little while, and that's another example of how the same music can be represented in different ways. The queuing features that Dorico 1 added in Dorico version 1.2, where you can have a dynamically linked cue showing up on a different stave, is another example of how Dorico's powerful approach to thinking about the way the music should be represented gives you benefits as a user of the software. Likewise, percussion. You can have your percussion shown in 3 different ways from the same source material, and again, all of that is because of this underlying architecture that allows the music to be presented in a different way, rather than just having it bound to a staff and bound to bars as it is in the other music notation programs. So if we just switch back to the score here, and we'll just have a look at some of the options that do exist for condensing, and I'll show you how you can input some music and use condensing at the same time. So there are some options for labeling. Obviously, there are different views about how staff labeling should be done for condensed scores. At the moment, what we have set here is that Dorico will stack up the player numbers. If we just, I can't zoom in a bit without dialog open, sorry. It'll stack up the player numbers vertically according to how they're allocated to stems. So here, for example, on the oboe staff, you've got oboes 1 and 2 in the upstem voice, and so those will show next to each other, but oboe 3 is in the downstem voice, so it shows below 1 and 2. Likewise for the piccolos and the flutes at the moment, there's only one staff active, so one stem active, I beg your pardon, so you just get the label with the player numbers next to each other. However, if you look at the next system, where now the condensation has changed and the 2 flutes are now in separate voices, you now get the numbers stacked up. Now, some of our beta testers told us they prefer it if they can have the labels always stacked up. So we provide an option for that. If you go down here into the staff labels page of engraving options, you can see this option. When stacking player numbers for condensed players vertically, ignore stem allocation. So if we do that, we'll just take a few seconds again because it has to kind of go and reprocess the whole of this movement of the planets. And once that is done, you'll see that the labels are now stacked up regardless of how the stem allocation is. So if you prefer the stem allocation to not affect the labels so that the labels look the same as long as the same players are on every staff, then you can do that. The other option that is here, which was an option that we added back in Dorico 2, but which now actually applies also to condensed music, is this one. Staff labels for identical adjacent solo instruments label each staff or group between staves. And again, if we just apply that option, you'll see that when you've got instruments like the clarinets, for example, where you've got multiple staves, then you'll see that instead of showing clarinet and then 1, 2, and clarinet 3 by every staff, you instead get the instrument name centered between the staves, or indeed centered on the stave as it is here, and then you get the label in the middle like that. Some other options for condensing can be found in the notation options dialog. That's in the right menu, or the key command is Command-Shift-N on Mac or Control-Shift-N on Windows. And you can see in here a few options to do with pitch crossing. So at the moment, for example, and it's worth pointing out that these options for pitch crossing apply when the phrases align. So lots of the pitch crossing you see in the 2 flute parts, for example, in Jupiter here, are because the flute phrases start at different points. And so we don't consider pitch crossing when we're already definitely in 2 voices and you've got 2 contrapuntal textures going on. We don't consider those as pitch crosses to worry about. But if you've got music that's a bit more simple, maybe a little bit more homophonic, but where one player is then crossing over the player above, you might well want to limit the number of pitch crosses that you see. And so this option allows you to choose between caring about pitch crossing or not caring about pitch crossing when you've got multiple players with phrases that align. Now, the idea about amalgamation is an interesting one. So amalgamation is what we do when you've got music that is almost the same rhythmically, but not completely the same. Here's a little bit, this is Mussorgsky, of course, Pictures and Exhibition. You can see here on the right-hand side with no amalgamation, when you've got your three players, because the first player has some passing notes in the melody, we then break players 2 and 3 out into their own stem, and they don't get to share a stem with player 1 at any point through that phrase. But with amalgamation switched on, whenever the rhythm is the same, you allow all of the notes to be in the same voice. And people have different opinions whether they like this or not. I personally find it easier to read, to see only where the rhythms are different. It helps to sort of show all the music. And of course, Dorico will never allow anything to amalgamate that wouldn't be completely clear otherwise. So for example, if you have one note head is representing, for example, 2 players playing a unison note, then Dorico will never amalgamate that with another player because it just wouldn't be clear. It wouldn't be clear anymore which note belongs to which player without a lot of hard thinking. And you also have a separate option for whether or not playing techniques should be amalgamated. So Dorico will always amalgamate slurs if they're the same between the upstem and the downstem voice. It will always amalgamate dynamics if they're the same between the upstem and the downstem voice. But with playing techniques, there's an option for whether or not they should be amalgamated or whether they should appear separately when there are 2 voices active. And then finally, the third option here, and this is an important one, is about how Dorico handles players who are resting on a particular system. So if you're going to use hide empty staves with your project, and so you don't necessarily care whether or not, say, the third flute or whoever it might be is shown on every system, you don't need to see that they're there. You know, you pad them on the first system, and then you're not worrying about them after that. Then you should choose this option, do not condense, because then that will allow any player who is resting for a whole system to get their own staff. They won't be condensed with anybody else. And then at that point, hide empty staves will kick in and that stave will be hidden away. If, on the other hand, you want to always sort of try and keep the pairings consistent, so for example, when you do have something like 3 flutes, if flute 2 isn't playing, then if you choose include in staff label, you can still get flutes 1 and 3 on the same staff, perhaps with flute 1 in the upstem voice and flute 3 in the downstem voice, and then flute 2 isn't there. So if you're hiding empty staves, that's fine, but you might find that you find it a little weird that now flute 2 is on his own or her own staff separately from the other 2. So you can either choose this option, pair with active player, which basically says, never mind whether flute 2 is playing or not, I always want flute 2 to be paired up with flute 1, so that keeps the pairings consistent from system to system, regardless of what the musical material is doing. Or you can say include in staff label, where you can say, well, I'm not going to hide an empty staff for the flute 2, but I do want to show that flute 2 is still playing. He or she just doesn't have any music right this moment. And so at that point, they just get added to the staff label, but they don't get any extra rests, because a condensed staff in Dorico, which can represent any number of players, up to 16 players in a group if need be, it can represent any number of players, but only a maximum of 2 stems at any time. So Dorico will always find the maximum condensation it can with 2 stems of music there. One other place to just quickly look at options for condensing is in layout options, which you can get out in setup mode, or you can use the key command Command-Shift-L, Control-Shift-L on Windows. And on the players page of the layout options dialog is a new condensing section here. And there's only 2 controls, well, there's 3, I suppose. There's the control to enable or disable condensing, but otherwise you can choose which players who would otherwise be eligible for condensing should or shouldn't condense. So, for example, in this score, I've chosen that the 2 timpani players shouldn't condense, but you could choose to allow them to condense if you like. And I've also created some custom condensing groups so that, for example, Dorico doesn't know, without you telling it, that your 6 horns should be paired up, for example, 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, or 1 and 3, 2 and 4, whichever kind of interlocking arrangement you might like. It'll just put all 6 horns in a single group, which may give good results depending on the nature of the music, or it may not. As I say, the editor for the original Holst Boozy study score chose to put them in 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6. So I did that. I'll just delete that one group and show you how it works. You press the plus button here. Up comes a little dialog which lists all of the eligible players who can be paired together, and you then choose the 2 that you want to put in, and they are added to the list like that. This is the way that you can also pair up instruments that would ordinarily perhaps not be automatically condensed together, like one common convention in orchestral music is to pair bass, trombone and tuba together. Again, Dorico doesn't yet do this automatically on its own, but you can easily go in and add a custom condensing group of bass, trombone and tuba. So there's lots and lots of options for condensing. There's a lot of detail as well in the version history, which is available when you download Dorico 3, some 15 or so pages of documentation about the feature. So you should definitely read it carefully. I think that there are certain things that it doesn't do yet. For example, you can't condense section players like violins, for example, in order to have divises written out on a smaller number of staves. You can condense vocal players together, section players for singers, but it doesn't quite work the way you might like because, for example, if you combine tenor and bass together by default, you'll see the treble clef and everything will be out by an octave because it's using the clefs from the top player. So there are some more things for us to work on with condensing, to be sure. But I just want to show you one more thing to do with condensing before we move on to looking at guitar notation, because there is also something quite neat in terms of how you can input music for condensing, given that you cannot edit the music directly once you've got condensing switched on. So I've opened up another simple empty project here where I've got 3 trumpets, and as you can see, condensing is enabled up here. Down here at the bottom, I'm looking at the same layout, but I'm in galley view. So of course, when you're using condensing, you can still edit the music in galley view because all of the staves appear in galley view. But if you want to actually input the music with condensing switched on, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend, there's no real benefit to having condensing switched on while you're inputting the music because, of course, you're asking Dorico to do a lot of calculations that it otherwise wouldn't have to do, so it slows things down a bit. Plus, when you're inputting the music, the condensation is going to change all the time anyway, because as music goes in, Dorico's remaking all of those decisions, and you're going to end up with more work than you really need. However, cool things can happen when you input music with condensing on, as I will demonstrate here. So here is a nice feature to help you work with multiple instruments, because obviously I know that a lot of you like to input music in short score. So you would actually input music for 2 flutes on one stave anyway, and then explode it out when you're producing the actual sort of parts and so on, and maybe you'll leave that exploded, or rather that manually condensed stave in your score, and then you'll produce a conductor score that way. Well, you don't do any of that stuff anymore, and in fact you don't even need to enter the music in short score. You can now simply extend the caret across multiple staves, which you do by pressing Shift down arrow or Shift up arrow if you want to expand it the other way. And then if I play notes on my MIDI keyboard here, you can see up on the top there that as soon as I put that first note in, it changed the condensing to be A3 and all 3 trumpets sharing one stave, and I'm inputting now the music in unison. I can also delete the music like this, and what's also fun is that I can even input slurs this way. So if, for example, I now press S for slur and put in the music like this, then I get slurs on every instrument as well. And that's not all, of course. I can also do it with dynamics as well. So I can type Shift D, P, hairpin, and then I can do, and then, for example, finish off here with another note. So this is really, really powerful. And of course, it doesn't work only with unisons either. If I play chords, for example, if I play 3-note chords, pardon the parallel motion, but I'm not very imaginative at the moment, you can see that again, Dorico will now split the music that you enter across the 3 staves, and you end up with the correct condensed result automatically. So this is a huge time saver, and if you're one of these people who likes to input music in short score, I recommend that you try this out instead. Create your 2 separate players as you ordinarily would, then extend the caret across to both players, and then input the music. If you put in unison music, if you put in dyads, Dorico will do the right thing. And of course, if you select 4 players and play 2 notes, then Dorico will make the same kinds of decisions that it makes when you use the explode feature as it decides how to allocate the music to each individual stave. And of course, don't forget in Dorico 2, we added a bunch of features for things like swapping the contents of 2 staves. So if you find that the allocation from voice to stave isn't quite what you wanted, you can easily swap them around. Very, very straightforward, very, very easy, and really, I hope, a big improvement for note input, regardless of whether you're using condensing or not. Let's move on to guitar. So I'm going to open up here a piece for, excuse me, a piece Dowland, because that's very rock and roll, which is pretty much exactly what you'd expect from me. And let's just hear a few bars of this little Allemande by John Dowland. So this piece demonstrates fingering and so on, but we'll come back to fingering in a moment. Let's look at tab first of all. People have been waiting a long time for Dorico to provide guitar tab, and the moment has arrived. Let's have a look at the strings and tunings dialog. So for any fretted instrument that you create in Dorico now, you can now show the strings and tunings dialog from the menu for the instrument in setup mode. So you actually hover over the instrument and then choose edit strings and tunings. And in here you can define the strings that you want for the instrument. You can define the fret spacing. You can define even things like, for example, if you have, say, banjo. This isn't a banjo, of course, it's a guitar, but the banjo's bottom string starts at the 5th fret. And Dorico handles all of that properly, so it knows, for example, that when you play the open banjo bottom string, that's obviously should appear as 0, but when you first finger the first actual fret on that string, it should be fret number 6, and it handles all of that automatically. And as far as I know, no other music notation program does that, no other one that isn't entirely focused on guitar, at least. And so Dorico has this nice detailed knowledge about the physical properties of the instrument, how many strings it has, the initial pitches of the strings, the fret spacing on the instrument, and it uses this for all of the features to do with guitar, for fingering, string indicators, for chord diagrams, and indeed for tablature. So how would we show tablature for Mr. Dowland's music here? We go to Layout Options, Command-Shift-L, Control-Shift-L on Windows. We go to the Players page, and there's now a new, when you have a guitar or another fretted instrument in your layout, you have a new little section of options here. And you can see that there are 4 options: notation only, tab only, which will show tab with rhythms, notation plus tab together, and tab and no rhythms. And we won't have time to get into all of these because there's a huge amount of sophistication. Oh, I'm losing my earpiece. A huge amount of sophistication in Dorico's tab features. But I just want to show a few little bits and bobs of it now. We'll just get rid of me so you can see the whole of the display here. So obviously we have a 6-string tab thing, and all of these fret numbers, all of these string allocations, these were all calculated automatically by Dorico. So it's able to look at the music at each point, consider all the notes that are being played, and then determine what string allocation should be used. And so if you then, for example, select a note on a tab staff and move it to the string below, which you can do using the M key, M to move to the string below, N to move to the string above, by analogy with the cross staff commands for normal notation staves, where M moves to the staff below and N moves to the staff above, when you've got, for example, a keyboard instrument. So when you make an explicit decision to say, well, actually, I want this bottom note to be played on the 2nd string up, on the A string, then Dorico will then say, okay, well, in order to make that chord more playable, now that's at the 5th fret, the other 2 notes should be fretted at the 7th fret on the next 2 strings. And so you can go through and make influence Dorico's decisions after you've shown the music in notation, just by selecting a note on tab and putting it up and down. And the neat thing, of course, is that also, as I mentioned earlier on, because Dorico has this unique approach to how the music is represented, the music on the notation stave and the music on the tab stave is actually linked together. And again, none of the other major notation programs have this feature. So now you can have the same music appearing on guitar tab and on notation. An edit in one is automatically reflected in the other, and this, I think, is a huge time saver and a very powerful feature. So what if you actually wanted to input some tab from scratch? Let's do that. If I just start a new project from a template with guitar and tab, and we'll just input a little bit of this Dowland, or at least I'll have a go at doing it. Again, we'll just create a time signature, 2/4, create a key signature of D major. And we won't do it on the notation stave, we'll do it on the tab stave. So you press the arrow key, the down arrow key, to move onto the tab staff. And note input on tab is a bit different than note input on a notation stave, because the number keys along the top row of the keyboard, instead of being used for durations, are instead used to choosing fret numbers. So in order to choose durations, you actually use the plus and minus keys, or I suppose technically the minus key and the equals key, the keys that you would normally use for sharps and flats in regular staff notation, you use them for lengthening and shortening notes. So if I press minus, it hops down to the next shortest duration on the panel. If I press plus, it moves to the next duration up. And the other thing to be aware of is that Dorico is always in chord mode when you're on a tab staff. So if I'm, for example, here and I want to put in a note and I want this to be an eighth note or a quaver, so I choose press minus to go from quarter note to eighth note, from crotchet to quaver, and then I simply type the fret number that I want, and you see that as soon as I put it in, now the notes appear on the notation stave as well. And of course, I can press right arrow to move on to the next thing, and so on and so forth. And the important thing to remember about this is, of course, now when you're inputting on tab, you're telling Dorico what string the music should be on. So you're not having to make any decisions, or Dorico's not having to make any decisions about string allocation at this point. You've told Dorico what string should be used. So, so I won't do any more tab input right now, but you get the general idea. There's lots and lots of options for tablature. Let's have a quick look at some of those so that you get an idea of the sorts of things that are possible. Dorico does have full support for showing tab with rhythms. So if, for example, I was to just very quickly bring up layout options and just change this to tab alone, then you'll see the notation stave will appear and we get beams and stems above the staff. You now see the time signature, which previously didn't appear on the tab staff. And when you're in tab with rhythms mode, you're going to see more notations like articulations, slurs, ties, and so on. But the tablature page of engraving options provides options for how the rhythms are going to be shown. There are lots and lots of different conventions used in different by different publishers and different types of music, different instructional materials, and so on. So we've tried to provide a full set of options, including for showing notes that are longer than a quarter note, so a half note or a whole note or longer, inside one of these enclosures. So you can choose between having either these elliptical enclosures or these sort of nice rounded lozenge-shaped enclosures. And this can help if you're doing music that's tab only. This can help to make the rhythms clearer. You can also see there are pretty comprehensive options for how tied notes should be handled. And again, you might want these to be different depending on whether you're showing the notation or not showing the notation. And before we move on to fingering, let me just open up another file that has some bends and things in, because Dorico does also provide support for bends. And if we look at towards the end of this piece by my colleague Richard, you'll see that here is a set of bends here. And so you can see that again on the notation stave, they're written with a sort of familiar angled line on the, and this is a pre-bend, of course, sorry, a grace note bend, beg your pardon. And this, so you see it from the grace note to going up above the stave, and it shows obviously the interval of the bend. This one's a full whole step or a tone bend. And these are all very easy to input. And in engrave mode, you have complete control over the shape and appearance of all of these items. You can move them up and down, you can change the shapes of the arrows, line thickness and so on are all provided in engraving options. There's really a huge amount of power and control. They don't play back yet, I'm afraid, although that is obviously something that we do absolutely plan to address in the future. Let's now look at some fingering. So if I open up this little snippet of music by Rodrigo, and you'll see that there's and this is, by the way, all of the placements of the fingerings in this file are completely default. And that might seem a little hard to believe if you tried to put together any guitar publications in other programs, other notation programs, and you'll know that positioning left and right hand fingering and string indicators for guitar is, it takes hours for even more than a few bars of music. And of course, the whole ethos behind Dorico is to save you time. We want to make working with Dorico as efficient as possible for it to get as close as possible to a result that you want, with you doing as little work as possible. And I think that the guitar fingering features really are a good demonstration of that philosophy in action. So I'm going to remove all of the guitar fingering from this. I won't put them all back in, but I'll put some of them back in, and you can see just how easy it is and how good the default positioning is. So if we've got a handy command to remove all the fingering in one fell swoop in the edit menu, you can go edit fingering, remove fingering, or reset fingering, and then they're all gone, all that work up in smoke. So to put in fingering, you use the Shift F popover, same popover as you've used in previous versions of Dorico, but when you do it on a guitar or another fretted instrument, you'll see that instead of showing the traditional little note with a 5 above it, as you see on the piano, for example, you instead see L for left hand and R for right hand. So you can actually input the left hand and right hand fingering separately. So I'll put the right hand fingering in first. I just, of course, now have to refer to the actual sheet music because I'm not a guitarist, so I don't know exactly how this should be fingered. But you simply type the fingering like this. You can skip over the grace notes if you don't need to. So you simply, I'm pressing space to move on to the next note here. And now when I've got these 3 together, then I must do it this way. I think this is right. That's actually upside down because I'm not a guitarist and I'm not very smart. But you can see how quick it is to put the right hand fingering in. Simply comma separate the ones as you build the chord up. It will then stack them up. And of course, as with all the other fingerings, these are associated with a particular note. So as you can see, when you select a note, and as I say, I've got those completely upside down, but when you select those notes, now the appropriate fingering, the appropriate right hand fingering lights up. What about left-hand fingering? So you go back to the beginning again, and then we type Shift F, and then we press down arrow. In fact, we don't need to, it's already on left-hand fingering. And then I simply type 1, for example, and then on I go. I can press the arrow keys, I can press space to navigate left and right, and add the fingerings like this. Now, notice what happens when I put this fingering in here. It actually creates a little extra space between the note and the preceding grace note. That's because all of these fingerings that appear in the staff, and the same is true for string indicators as well, they're all included in Dorico's automatic collision avoidance. So it's part of that complex 2D jigsaw puzzle that Dorico does to the left and the right, and indeed above and below everything that you input in Dorico. Also, a nice little touch, I hope you can see this, is that the 1 fingering here has an erased background. Now, we looked at a lot of guitar music and couldn't really find very many examples of this being done. However, I think that it's a case where it would have been done in hand engraving days if it wasn't too laborious to do it. But of course, because the engraver is typically going to strike out the whole staff in one go at the beginning with their rastral tool, to then go back and fill in the bits where the fingerings are going to be would have been a huge amount of work. So instead, they just stamp the fingerings on top of the staff lines. At least this is my assumption. But because we're drawing all of this, of course, you know, we can do what we like with Dorico's own drawing. So we chose to erase the background by default. If you don't like it, of course, there are options to turn it off very straightforwardly if that is what you would prefer. So you can happily make your way across here, adding the fingering numbers. To add a string indicator, if you open the properties panel, our first trip into the properties panel today, there are comprehensive oh, no, I don't want to open notes, thanks very much. There are comprehensive options in here for all of this. So you can, for example, as you see here, there's the fingering positions, the plucked fingerings, and so on. String indicator is all the way over here to the right. It's not really a fingering after all. But when you do that, Dorico will then show the appropriate string indicator inside the staff to the right-hand side of the note. So again, there are lots of engraving options for choosing exactly where that will appear. Now, how does Dorico know that note's on the second string? Well, it's from calculating where that note would be fingered if it was shown on tablature, which, as we've already said, Dorico uses that knowledge about the instrument behavior whenever it's doing anything for notation or for tablature. But of course, if you really feel that note should be played on a different string, you can enable the property, and all of the notes on which that, all of the strings rather, on which that note is playable appear in there. Quick look at the fingering page of engraving options, just so you get an idea of the sophistication of the options that we provided. Here are the options for the right-hand fingering. It seems like every letter in the alphabet is used to describe the the right-hand pinky finger or little finger, so you can choose from 6 variations. Dorico also provides things like fingering slides for guitar. You can do things like these where you show lots of notes that are played by the same fingering. You simply assign, for example, P to all 3 of those notes. Then there's a property that you enable down in the properties panel that then shows it with a bracket and the thing below. You can also show fingerings on an arpeggio, because often when you're strumming a chord or when you're spreading a chord, you want to show on the arpeggio line that a particular finger is used. And again, you do that by selecting the arpeggio line and enabling the fingering for that, and so on and so forth. forth. There are also some additional fingering options in Dorico 3 for keyboard music, particularly with cross-staff music. You can even put some of these intra-staff fingerings that we use for left-hand guitar fingering. You can use those for keyboard fingering as well. So lots and lots of goodies for fingering. Before we leave guitar altogether, let me just very, very quickly talk to you for a moment about guitar chord diagrams. If I just create a solo guitar here, it doesn't really matter what's in here. And then if we just very quickly put in a few bars, and I will then also put in, for now, a slash region, since I can't actually write any music right this moment. And then if we want to then add some chord symbols, of course, we know how we do this. We sort of do this, D-7, G. I'm afraid I'm not very imaginative again when it comes to these chord progressions either, but you'll just have to live with those. And then if we want to show chord diagrams in setup mode, we show the context menu for the player, and we choose in here which tuning we want. The ones that Dorico has tunings for in its built-in library are shown at the top. And when you do that, then you will see the chord diagrams appear here. Now, we have a few tricks up our sleeve. Dorico doesn't treat these the way that other programs do. It's not a library of chord symbols where there's a particular shape for A minor and then you've got to have that same shape for, say, B minor or C minor or whatever it might be. Instead, Dorico uses its knowledge about the instrument and about how many strings it has, the initial pitches of the strings, and what the tunings are, so that in fact when you define a chord shape for a chord diagram, Dorico thinks of that in terms of the hand shape on the instrument rather than it being, say, an A minor. And the neat thing about this is that it means that you can, for example, reuse the same shape up and down the neck. So as long as it doesn't require an uncomfortable bar to span all of the strings that perhaps might be open, for example, when it's at the nut, but then as you move it up the neck, you can bar those strings, then Dorico will actually allow that chord to be used for other chords up the neck. And this is again pretty neat because it means that the choice of chords is much greater because, and of course guitarists tend to think about how they physically play the chord on the neck of the instrument. And so we've tried to kind of come at it from the approach that a guitarist might take, and as a result, I think it's quite a natural workflow. If you want to change the chord symbol, the chord diagram rather, you've got for a given chord symbol, you can do Option Q, and you can see that shows cycles through the available ones. If you want to see all of them at a glance, you can do You can do Shift-Alt-Q, and that then gives you a little chooser, and again, you can press return on the one that you want and choose that one. But you can also, of course, go in here and you can edit the chord diagram. Now, if you change all the notes so that they're wrong, Dorico will warn you that, hey, this was meant to be an A minor, D doesn't really belong in A minor, and so you get that warning there. But of course, it won't stop you from using that chord, so if you really want to, that chord, now just for this particular instance of A minor, there it is, and you can use it that way. You can also edit the whole library of chord diagrams in engrave mode. If we look at the chord diagrams page of engraving options, you'll see that there are many, many options for the appearance of the chord diagrams, offset of the fret numbers, and so on and so forth. So we feel that although there's more for us to do on chord diagrams, in particular, we'd like to add a feature to show the chord diagrams used in a song at the beginning above the top system. Then we think that these are tremendously useful as they are now. So let's move on to talking about harp pedaling. This is a feature that, surprisingly, when we were doing our beta testing for Dorico 3, the harp pedaling feature was one of the ones that generated the most discussion amongst our beta testers. We had a lot of beta testers who were working on orchestral music. And even experienced arrangers will find that working with the harp is quite challenging because the instrument has these technical constraints about the pedals that it has. So a concert harp has 7 pedals arranged around the base of the instrument. There are 3 on the left and there are 4 on the right. And these pedals determine what pitch the strings play. So you have one pedal for D, and all of the Ds in all of the octaves of the harp are then affected by that pedal. So if the pedal is in its up position, the note is flattened. If it's in the middle, it's in a natural position. If it's pushed down to the floor, then the note is sharpened. And the working with these is, it's quite challenging. You have to think as you're writing for harp about whether the part is actually going to be playable by the harpist. And of course, harpists are also used to receiving parts from well-meaning arrangers that are full of markings that they don't necessarily completely agree with. So even if you decide not to give markings to your harpist when you actually come to give them the part, it can nevertheless be useful to have a look at how the logistics of managing the pedals are going to sort of work out when you're actually using, preparing the part for the harpist. So if we now look at this simple piece here, here's a little piece for harp, and you'll notice straight away that many of the notes are red, and that's because Dorico's notes out of range feature now takes into account the current pedal settings for the harp. And we have a feature now that allows Dorico to calculate the appropriate harp pedals for the music as it goes along. It's in the right menu, and it's Calculate Harp Pedal. I have assigned a non-default shortcut for the use in today's demo of Control H. You can assign your own shortcut if you like. You can also type harp pedals in to the Shift P popover if you want to tell Dorico exactly how the harp should work. But if I choose that, then you'll see that straight away Dorico has created a pedal diagram, and now, up until the second bar, the notes that were previously red are now black, and that's because it's worked out that until at least this E natural is introduced in the second bar, that pedal settings is going to work for that passage of music. If I then go to the beginning of the second bar and do my shortcut, you'll see that again, annoyingly, we have to change pedal because we need both E natural and E flat in that bar. But if I just keep pressing Control H every time I see notes that are red, then you'll see that every time Dorico is able to figure out what the harp pedal should be. And notice how it's showing you a partial pedal change. So anytime when only, and again, this is a user-definable threshold, but anytime only a handful of the pedals need to change, maybe up to 3 of them, and again, a threshold that you can edit in engraving options to define this, then it will show a partial pedal change. And there are lots, again, of different conventions about where harp pedal changes should appear, whether they should appear between the staves, full changes between the staves, partial changes below the stave, whatever it might be. You can choose where they go. If you select a note on the lower staff of the harp and create the harp pedal there, it'll go on the lower staff of the harp. If you, on the other hand, create it on the upper staff, then it will go there. I'm just going to get to the very end of the piece here. And while I was talking, so I could have done it much more quickly if I hadn't been talking to you at the time, we're able to add harp pedaling, which may not be exactly what the harpist will choose to do, but it gives you a good idea as the arranger or the copyist about how playable that harp part is, how challenging it is to get the pedal changes in at the places that you need them. So while I'm here, I'm also going to show you a little bit more about playback templates, which is another feature that we've added in Dorico 3. The one thing that Dorico maybe doesn't have a beautiful sound for is harp. So you might have access to a nicer harp sound, and you might want to use it for this project and for other projects. So I'm going to load up Contact here, and Contact will hopefully appear. I think we're having a moment. Dorico and I are having a moment, so I'm just going to try that again. And you can then make a playback template that includes particular combinations of instruments that you might need, as for example, we might have for a harp or a piano that you like. For example, you might choose to use Piano Tech or something like that for your pianos, and so you can then tell Dorico, here is Piano Tech. It's set up to use a piano, and then we'll then have the ability to reuse that configuration in another file, or in any future file, in fact, so that you never have to make that choice again. And this is really one of the big improvements in playback that we've been able to introduce in Dorico 3, is that to give you a lot more control over how things are going to work. So we're back to where we should be now. So if we go back to the Mac, and you can see now that I'm in play mode, and we've got Halion, and Halion is using its orchestral harp patch, which I'm sorry to say is not particularly convincing. So let's add, whoops, don't need to add 2, but add Contact here, and Contact will appear. And in Contact's interface, which has appeared here we are. We have Sound Iron Elysium Harp, which is a lovely harp instrument, and we can load that in. We don't, for this particular thing, we don't really need to make any further configurations here in the endpoint setup dialog, but normally, if, for example, you were choosing some VSL strings or brass or whatever it might be, you should come into the endpoint setup dialog and make sure the appropriate expression map is chosen for each instrument that you're choosing. We then simply need to assign the harp over here in play mode to contact. And now if we go back to the endpoint setup dialog, you'll see that it now knows, okay, channel 1 on this instance of contact should be playing by harp. And if I then do save endpoint configuration and choose, for example, Elysium Harp like this, I'm now saving this as a reusable component that I can use in another project later on. So I can then go to Playback template, and I can, for example, create a new playback template, which I'll call, let's say, HSO plus Elysium Harp. And so then what I do is the manual harp that I've already created, Elysium Harp, gets added here. And then I add an automatic one because, of course, the Elysium Harp configuration that I've created only provides a sound for a harp instrument, which is obviously then not going to be very good for any other instrument at all. So I need to add something else as a fallback. And so in this case, I'll then choose to add HSSE and HSO. So that's the full Halion sounds that come with Dorico. And then when I press OK, now I've got this new playback template, which will appear in this dialog for any future project that I create. So if I ever, in this way, I can set up my own preferences for strings in this library, brass in this one, piano from Pianotech, harp from Elysium Harp or from Iconica, whatever it might be, you can set these things up very straightforwardly. So let's just play this back from Elysium Harp because it's a rather fetching sound. So you get the idea. So while we're on the subject of playback, there's obviously lots of new improvements in playback in Dorico 3. I won't get a chance to show you all of them, but I do definitely want to show you. We joked before the stream that we fear that might happen, and indeed it has. So now we only have half a Steinberg logo behind me. This is a very sad day. But nevertheless, moving on, we can look at the Olympus Choir Micro library, which is included with Dorico 3 and is a wonderful new set of choral sounds for use with Dorico, which is from the team at Sound Iron. Historically, they've done stuff for Contact, but they've now sort of re-engineered Olympus Choir Micro to work in Halion. So we're able to now bundle it with Dorico 3, which is really wonderful. So I've got the last few bars of Lauridsen's O Magnum Mysterium here. We'll just play this back. And that already sounds so much nicer than the sounds that we were providing in Halion before. But you can even, there are other things that you can do with it. So if I just open up Halion here, and you can see the Olympus interface there, and I'm actually going to choose this Gregorian sound, which is even more lugubrious and with really rather wonderful reverb in the background. So if we just go through here, and you'll see that now on the right-hand side, you've got the edit window for the Olympus Choir sounds, and you can see there are two layers, and the layers correspond to effectively the lower and the upper register, and you can even have it blending between an oo and an r between the two layers. As it happens, I'm going to go for oo sustain. Sustain, of course, means that the notes will loop and they'll play continuously. If you have staccato or marcato, then which obviously is a good effect in itself, but it's not so good for this kind of music where we've got the notes are all held out. So we'll just choose sustain for these last ones. These are also absolutely awash in a beautiful reverb. So this is how the Gregorian sound from Olympus Choir Micro sounds. So the nice thing about the Olympus Choir Micro sounds is that they're really versatile. You've got marcato, staccato, sustains. They speak, they rise very quickly, so they always sound like they're on time. They also sound like they're in tune, which is definitely a very a wonderful improvement on the previous sounds. And they're just a really, really usable set of sounds for working with vocal and choral music. While I'm in play mode, just very quickly to show you this new button here in the instrument track header, we now have a velocity editor in Dorico 3, and you can do things like, you know, change velocities like this. You've got a line tool, you have a freehand pencil drawing tool, so you can create, obviously not very many notes in this, so it doesn't make a particularly interesting profile, but you can edit velocities with all of the familiar tools. Also worth saying that in the automation editor, there's also now pitch bend at the top, which allows you to create, again, draw a pitch bend. The central line obviously represents sort of normal pitch, and you can then draw a pitch bend above and below that, which is really very, very helpful in certain circumstances. So, of course, if you really wanted to add your own bends, you could now add them for guitar using the pitch bend editor in play mode. So we're very nearly out of time, and sadly, and perhaps predictably, I've only covered half of the things that I was hoping to cover. So I might just sneakily go on a little bit past the top of the hour here in order to cover a few more things. I do definitely want to show you very quickly something from our new feature for playing techniques. So one of the things that we've heard a lot about from our users over the last couple of years is that, you know, they need more access to playing techniques and more possibilities for displaying playing techniques. And so we've tried to, I'm about to write some extremely unimaginative music here for solo violin. And I apologise in advance for the unimaginative of nature of this, particularly because it's not going to fit at all with the playing technique I'm about to create on it. But you can now, with some new features added in Dorico 3, for example, if you wanted to go, let's say, from sul tasto to sul ponticello, again, doesn't make any sense with this music, but you get the general idea. You can now type Shift P, you can type sul tasto, and then put this little sort of fake arrow in, a hyphen followed by a greater than sign, and then type sul pont. And then when you press return, you get this rather nice beastie here. And if we look at it in engrave mode, you'll see that it's actually grouped together. It's one item. And of course, like any item in Dorico, I can drag this left or right to change its rhythmic position. I can also move the start of it, which moves just the start. I can move the whole thing with alt left and right. So all of the normal controls that you would use for playing techniques now work on these as well. And you can change the line style. You can change quite a lot of things about the line style, in fact. So if you go into, again, an engrave mode and then look in the line style menu here, you can have, for example, a wide wiggly line, or you can have a flat-topped wedge, or you can have a symmetrical wedge, or you can have a dash line, or you can have, and so on and so on and so on. There are a lot of options here. There are no options just yet for defining your own lines, although that is something that we're planning for the future. But if we look in the playing techniques dialog in the engrave menu, you'll see that there's this new continuation tab in the editor here. And this specifies what the default continuation type is for a given playing technique. So if it's a text-based one, you can choose between showing sim, so it doesn't actually show any kind of continuation except for the word sim, or a line. And if it shows a line, then there are two lines that it can show. There's a duration line, which is one that shows if there's no playing technique that it's transitioning to, then it will use the duration line. Whereas if it's transitioning from one playing technique to another, then you'll see a transition line, which is typically a different one, normally an arrow of some kind. You can also choose where that is going to be aligned to the item. And again, there's different options based on whether it's a text-based playing technique or a character or symbol or glyph-based playing technique, because of course you don't necessarily have things like bass lines and descenders if you're using an SVG graphic, for example, as your playing technique at the start or the end of the line. And of course you have full editing in engrave mode. So for example, if I grab this sul pont and move it up and down, the arrow follows suit. Likewise, if I move this one, I can move that independently of the whole line, and I have grabbed that handle to move the whole thing. I can also edit the arrow individually as well, and I can move this. And you have a lot of possibilities basically with these new tools. So we think that hopefully you'll find this very, very useful. Also, very quickly, since I now officially am out of time, is just to say a couple of things about the features that we've added for working with lyrics. There's three in this version that are worth knowing about. So if I just put in a quick time signature, so I can't actually remember the words to Talus's canon, so here are some words. They are quite bad, but at least now they've not gone mad. Terrible doggerel. But I add them for two reasons. One is to show you now that if I add, for example, if I add the end of the canon here, okay, sorry altos, that's rather high, but you know, it is what it is. So if we now copy these lyrics to the clipboard, which we can do by filtering for them, edit, filter, lyrics, and then copy them, we can now actually paste them in one by one into the, which of course in this case is not a big deal, because of course you could just copy and paste them and it would work just fine. But if you've got different rhythms in the different vocal parts, then being able to copy and paste them a syllable or a word at a time can be a real time saver. If we go to engrave mode, you'll find that when you select a lyric, you now have a handle at the start of the line, and this now allows you to adjust the vertical position of the lyric line up and down. And that's very helpful, I think. You can align it in big jumps. If you've got multiple lines of lyrics, each one is adjustable independently. Lines above and below the staff are adjustable independently, and so on. So that's also very helpful. And then finally, for lyrics, there is a new dialogue edit line of lyrics. If you select a lyric and then go in there, and you can see that this is a way of seeing all of the lyrics for your line in one go. And then if we were to change that to, I don't know, somebody called Chad, and when you press OK, then at the end you'll see that the lyrics are updated. So it's a helpful way of spotting typos in your lyrics and providing a lot of utility in terms of finding typos and making sure that you haven't missed any words out and so on. And in fact, if you look at what the dialogue does, it won't allow you, if you happen to change the number of lyrics, so for example I remove a word, remove the second word, for example, you'll see that down here in the bottom of the dialogue it now says current number of lyrics 15, target 16, and it won't let you go back in until you've got the right number of lyrics. So hopefully that's a useful editing tool for lyrics. And just the very last thing I'll very, very quickly show is that Dorico also now adds a comments feature. There's a new comments panel in the right-hand side. You can add a comment by having a selection or at the carets position and then type Alt-C. You then type your comment in here. It appears in the music as a little speech bubble, and it appears in the right-hand side with the comment. You can also export the comments, so you can print them out into a nice formatted table, and you can then use them as a proofing aid. There are so many other things that I had hoped to show in the demo today, but I spent too much time talking about condensing. I hope that you will take the time to visit our YouTube channel. Obviously, some of you might be watching this on YouTube right now, but if you go to youtube.com/Dorico, you'll find a playlist where my colleague Anthony has created 14, count them, 14 tutorial videos that cover most of the main new features all of the main new features in Dorico 3, and covers in a small amount of detail some of the other improvements that are in the program. If you're interested in finding out more about all of the new improvements, the easiest way to do that, aside from watching the videos, is to go into Steinberg Download Assistant, find Dorico Pro 3 in there, in the Dorico category, and download the Dorico version history PDF. It's something like 75 pages. The vast majority of those pages cover the new features in exhaustive detail, so you'll get all of the information that you need there. I'm delighted to say that Dorico Pro 3 and Dorico Elements 3 are available today, so if you would like to buy them, you can go directly to the online shop at steinberg.net, particularly if you're updating from Dorico Pro 2 or Dorico Elements 2 or even Dorico 1, then you'll need to go to the Steinberg online shop in order to buy. If, on the other hand, you're new to Dorico and you're coming from another program, or perhaps it's your first notation program, you can either buy directly from Steinberg or you can buy from any of our resellers, and you can find a reseller locator on the Steinberg website as well. If you are updating, just make sure that you run all of the installers when you download them. Do install the sounds as well, even though the majority of the sounds are the same between Dorico 2 and Dorico 3. Of course, they include the Olympus Choir micro sounds, which you won't get, and so the vocal parts won't play back if you don't install them. Of course, if you have any further questions, I know that John and my other colleagues have been answering questions during the stream today, but of course you can find us on social media at Dorico Official on Twitter, the Dorico Official page on Facebook, we're at Dorico on Instagram. Leave a comment, tell us what you think, ask us a question. Likewise, you can find us on the forum where I and other members of the development team can be found every day. That's at dorico.com/forum. I hope you've enjoyed this live stream. Hope you have found what I've showed you. They're just a little tiny bit of what Dorico 3 can do. I've been able to show you this afternoon. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching.